What's up, amigos? It's the Prodigy Maker Show, episode 49, with yours truly, Chris Lewitt, high performance coach and author of The Secrets of Spanish Tennis and the Tennis Technique Bible. Today is more of a Technique Bible show. I want to talk about the volley, a little bit about my philosophy on the volley, my methodology, and the technique that I like to build, especially for young players. How do you develop the volley for young players? The last episode 48, check it out. It was a good one, kind of an interesting show where I talked about how they developed the volley in Spain, particularly relating to the great legends of Spain like Luis Bruguera and William Pato Alvarez and Jose Higueras and legends like that, their volley philosophy and how they developed the net game. And so on today's show, I promised you guys I would talk about how I like to develop the net, the volley. Maybe we can talk a little smash, but essentially what I'm looking for in terms of the technique. So in many of the earlier shows that we did, I like to talk, we did some very technical shows. And so I want to kind of get back to my roots a little bit with the volley technique. Volley technique is sometimes over practice, sometimes under practice. Some coaches spend a lot of time on the volley with young children. My expertise is in childhood development, junior tennis, and high performance training for young kids, especially younger ones, kids under 12. And do you start with the volley? My dad started me with the volley when I was a kid. I think that was probably a mistake. Do you start with the ground strokes? Do you try to work everything all at once? I think these are common questions in junior development. So I've touched on these topics before, but I just thought we'd do a show about it and kind of talk about the volley. If you happen to tune in live, let me know any questions you have about the volley, whether it's technique or philosophy, how to develop the net game, and we can have a good discussion about that. So the volley in general, I was thinking about how I would categorize or explain my philosophy, and I guess it's a hybrid, as in many things that I do, a hybrid between what I learned from my Israeli coach, Gilad Bloom, and his Israeli style, I would say, which was a very technical approach to the volley, and what I've learned from studying so many years in Spain about how they developed the net game. So I think I've come to a happy medium or melding of those two philosophies and those two styles, and I'll try to just summarize that for you and explain it. But essentially what that means is, for my old coach, for Gilad, for the Israeli approach, it's all about getting to the net as much as possible. And Gilad had a very, I would say, exquisite, I don't want to say complicated, maybe a little bit complicated style to the volley method, where Gilad wanted a very sliced volley, a volley with a lot of underspin, and you have to have pretty much a complete game at the net. You have to have every shot in terms of sharp angles, drop shots, half volleys, reflex volleys, and approach half volleys, mid-court volleys, and of course swinging volleys. So the idea was you take the ball in the rise, and your goal essentially in a point is to transition to the net and finish points at the net. It's very aggressive, and I think his aggressive style and his technical approach was very exquisite and a little bit complex. A lot of details with the volley form. We can dig into that a little bit. And in comparison, in Spain, I found a more simple approach, a more conservative approach to the net. Many times in Spain, you don't the coaches don't necessarily encourage you to go to the net. The net is valued, but only after spending a good amount of time on the baseline, structuring the point there, and sometimes you'll just win the point there. So I think there's a very different philosophy in general. It's important for coaches and players and parents to understand the difference and where they are in that spectrum. So are you going to build a player whose main goal is to dominate the net, to take every ball early and attack, a la Roger Federer, especially in his later incarnations here as he gets older? Or are you going to try to develop a player who's primarily a baseline player who will take opportunities to move to the net to finish points, but it's not necessarily looking to do that as a general overarching meta strategy. So a baseline player who hits a big shot and moves forward and finishes is different than someone who is actively trying to win dozens of points in a match at the net, including going to the net behind the serve, which is also something we could maybe discuss, because the serve and volley is very much now pretty rare strategy. I think that it has a chance to come back, but what we've seen in the last 10 or 20 years is many professional players and players at all levels moving away from the net, going to the net much less frequently. So that's been a big trend at the top level, and I think that's also filtered down to lower levels as well. Maybe not at the club or recreational level, but certainly higher level junior and college tennis as well. So if I have a little kid in front of me, maybe an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old, when they're young, I really don't spend that much time on the volley. For a little kid, I want to make sure they have a complete game, but they don't have to get there by 8. They don't have to get there by 10. I'm speaking in generalities here, but in general, I want players to be comfortable at the net. I don't want my players to have any fear of the net. But I also want to work within their personality. So that being said, sometimes you have a player who is very gung-ho and aggressive, and they love to create, very creative type players. Sometimes I call them magicians. And they, from a very young age, even 5, 6, 7, 8, they love the net. They want to be there, creating, volleying, attacking. And when I see a special kid like that, I tend to do a little more network with them. But in general, most kids who are not really magicians in that respect, they're not creative, artistic geniuses. I can think of this one little boy who I coached recently, Ty Switzer, who is the number 1 player in the East here, and he's now on the ITF circuit, and he has big goals for the Pro Tour in mind, and amazing, talented kid. And from 8 or 9 years old, he always had great hands, always had good volleys, and I nurtured that. I was not foolish enough to say, oh, no, you can start working on the volley when you're 13 or 12 or 13 or 14. Don't worry, we have lots of time. I definitely developed his baseline skills, but I always respected the fact that he was a net lover and that he was going to have this beautiful all-around, all-court game. You could see it already at 8 or 9 years old in this super talented kid. Ty Switzer, remember the name? Great talented player. I think you'll hear that name in the future on the Pro Tour if we're lucky. And at the same time, I think for most kids who are not really magical like that, they don't need to spend 50% of the time at the net. I see it's a big mistake that coaches make developmentally, parents too. I think they spend too much time at the net when the kids are young and their ground strokes and footwork are not fully formed. I'm a huge believer, and it's probably the Spanish influence, all the studying I've done there over the years in Spain, where I want to see a young player who moves well. I want to see a young player who has a rock solid technique in the backhand and forehand, and spend a lot of time on the serve for kids, under 8, under 10, under 12. And that's not to say we never work on the volley, but we definitely underweight the volley unless they show me that aptitude and that love of the net, that those magical skills, the creative genius, the artistry, where they love to be up there. And when I see that in a kid, I try not to shut it down. I think it's a shame when a coach just shuts that down and says, no, don't go there, don't go to the net. But at the same time, I think for most players, they need to understand that tennis is a game that is built from the baseline. To be a top junior player, you have to have, almost without exception, strong, consistent ground strokes. You have to move well. You have to be able to run well and position well. And so those are very Spanish ideas. And I think that should be, if you have a pie and you're going to start cutting out percentages of your time, your training pie, your training time, the volley should be, 10%, 20%, 25%. The volley shouldn't be taking up 50% or more of the development time in a young kid, unless you have some, maybe that exception to the rule, that kid who's just, you can see that's going to be a big part of it's where their personality draws them. So that's what I would say at the start is try to find a balance between the net and the baseline work, and overweight a little bit more the baseline and the movement, the footwork, because I just think it's wrong when, I have kids who come to me at 10 or 11 or 12, and you can see that the coach has spent time at the net. They've taken many lessons, private lessons, and a typical private lesson, and I've seen this cycle go on for years and years, is a coach will take a kid, they'll do a warm-up, some ground stroke work, and then they'll devote part of the hour to volleys and then a little bit of serving at the end. And that's a common lesson. I think when that lesson is allowed to continue for a long time, 6 months, a year, multiple years, you end up with a kid typically at 10, 11, or 12. And I see a lot of these kids, and this is my warning to all of you, if you're in that kind of environment where everything is so balanced and so and the coach is training the volley, the serve, the ground strokes all in one lesson without really digging into the repetitions from the ground, the movement and footwork with more focus and more detail. I've seen it so many times, and that at 11, 12, you have a player who is not fundamentally sound from the baseline, doesn't move that great, has inferior movement skills, is not consistent enough to be a top-ranked player, and yet they have some good hands at the net. And I just think that what's the point of that? For me, as an elite junior developer, as a top junior coach, what I want by the time a kid's 11 or 12 is I want that kid to be a machine from the baseline and to have no fear of going to net. Now that doesn't mean that they're going to go to net a lot. They may go. Some personalities may go to net a little more than others, as I mentioned. But in general, as a general outline or blueprint or game plan, is you want a young kid to be super solid from the baseline, to move very well, move efficiently with balance and good fine-tuning to the ball with the feet, good positioning, as they say in Spain, with the capability to move forward, preferably behind a big shot like a big forehand, and understanding how you build points from the backcourt, zone 3, to the midcourt, zone 2, and to the front court, zone 1. And that points can be structured that way, but they don't necessarily have to be structured that way. And that's the difference between the Spanish approach and what my old coach, Gilad Bloom, who's a wonderful coach, very talented coach. He's brilliant in many respects. when he taught me the Israeli system, it's very much about attacking, and that every point you're looking to move forward. And that's the way my dad taught me. That's the way a lot of players played in the 80s and in the 90s. Many guys whom I modeled, like Pete Sampras or Stefan Edberg, Boris Becker, some of my favorite players from back in the day, their games were predicated on taking the ball early and finishing at the net, putting pressure on the opponent, and carrying the day that way. And I just moved away from that. I played like that as a junior. I copied Sampras. I love Sampras so much. I loved Pat Rafter. I loved Tim Henman. I loved Stefan Edberg. All of the net rushers. I was a big fan, and I used to model my game the same way when I was a kid. And I've moved away from that, both for my own game as I got older and started training in Spain and became a much more all-around player. And I'm so happy now that I can play well from the baseline and build points and win points in multiple ways. And as we've seen the same evolution with junior and professional tennis, where many players have also moved away from rushing that type of model. And so for me, I think I learned the game backwards, and in many ways I'm trying not to build my players the way I learned. I certainly wouldn't want my players to have really good net game and holes in their baseline. I'd much rather have it, if I had my druthers, I'd much rather have it the other way around. Give me a player who's solid from the back, good ground strokes, steady, moves well, good endurance, good capacity to suffer, good physical capabilities, good movement skills. Give me that player, and I can always we can always add the net. We can always add a good transition. We can always add improve the volley. I'd much rather have that than the other way around. So I guess a lot of the way I'm looking at a young child is through that lens and from that perspective. I don't want to have a player who's 11 or 12 who is not solid, as they say in Spain, is not solid from the back, and instead has incredibly good hands and great capabilities with the volley, but they got big holes in their game from the backcourt. I think that makes me really nervous, and to be honest, I think that makes the player very nervous. That builds, unfortunately, a lot of anxiety in a kid. So a kid who knows that they're not that consistent from the back, they don't know how to rally, they're not capable of rallying 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 shots. When a player knows that, inside of them, intrinsically, deep inside their soul, it's anxiety producing, because you know that you have a limited amount of shots that you can make, and you're forced to rush that net, especially as a kid. If you're smaller, very difficult to rush that. A lot of pressure on your shoulders to try to win point after point after point that way. So that's kind of how I see it. Just a short little synopsis or summary of kind of the Spanish way, a little more patient and go to net if there's an opening, versus the Israeli way, the way I learned it from my coach. And I definitely try not to teach the way I learned, or the way I learned it from my dad. Attack, attack, attack. Go to net. Every point should finish at the net. You should try to strike first. The player who rises to the net is usually victorious. That sort of approach versus, no, the Spanish approach. No, the net is good. I like to go to the net. I don't need to go to the net to win. Sometimes I may not go to the net. I may win this match from the back, or I may have some opportunities to go to the net and finish, and that's fine. That's excellent. That's definitely more of the Spanish point of view, vis-a-vis, or juxtaposed with the Israeli, or however you want to call it, the more aggressive view of the net and net attacking. So in terms of the technique, because I promised a little bit of technique today, well, technique you get into a lot of debates about technique, but when I have a little kid in front of me, we got to make sure, number one, the grip is good. There's usually one grip on the volley. the serve grip. So it's typically a continental grip. Some players have a small shift with the forehand volley. I usually try to get one grip just to make things simple and to save a little time. But you should be aware that some players have a subtle shift, maybe in the heel pad, not very severe, and you should be aware that some players will hit more of a flatter type volley versus a slice volley. And I think that is the big question you have to ask yourselves as a coach or a parent is, do I want my kid to have more of a underspin volley that skids, or do I want them to have more of a flatter volley where the impact is more direct? And I actually wrote an article about this for Tennis Player magazine. I think it was published last year in John Yandel's Tennis Player magazine, whom I'm a contributing editor there. I've written many articles for Tennis Player, which is a great resource, by the way, a great technical resource. And I tried to break it down. I think you have to decide, and you can sort of find the middle road too, but you have to decide, am I going to teach more of a slice volley, where I focus on underspin? I want my players to get good underspin, or more of a flat, simpler volley. And that's why I mentioned that the Israeli volley that I learned was definitely more of a slice volley, where you try to cut the ball and get a lot of backward rotation on the ball. And typically it's almost more of a little bit more of a chopping action, high to low with an open racket face. And that's why I mentioned it's a little more exquisite. Maybe it's a slightly more complex technique, as opposed to being more of a blocking action where the racket face is more square to the ball and you're just making impact, and it can be quite powerful, but essentially a flat style. And I think there's some room for middle ground. And what I usually do is I take the player, I try to get them to impart underspin, because I think that underspin is important for the control of the volley, and also it helps the volley skid and die. And you can apply different, what they say in billiards, different effects. You can apply different effects to the ball, different types of spin. You can apply side spin, back spin. You can also, of course, hit topspin volleys. I'm a big believer in the topspin volley, which is something that I definitely learned in the Israeli system, but in the Spanish system, it's a big deal to take the ball out of the air with topspin. So I think, for me, I lean towards teaching players how to spin the ball with their volley. So that is, they should have a topspin volley, especially young kids, because young kids get moonballed a lot, and the topspin volley is a great way to mitigate a moonball strategy, an opponent who's utilizing a moonball strategy. So that's one thing, just tactically. It's good to have when you're a kid. And I just think philosophically, you want a player to be able to do any type of, to manipulate the ball, just like a cue ball in billiards, to be able to manipulate the ball with different spins at the net. So that means they might use their wrist to cut the ball, sharp angle, or sometimes when the ball is coming at your body, you have to cut across the ball with inside-out spin. There's outside-in spin, so it's like different side spins on the ball, and a good fundamental backspin on the ball when you have a standard volley. And then what I try to do as a middle road is I tell my players, if the ball is coming very fast, you can just set up the racket face more square and utilize more of a blocking action. You can hit that one a little flatter. So for me, I always try to find a middle ground, a synthesis, rather than just taking one position or another. And that's sort of the happy medium that I found. We try to get a good slicing volley, and I teach that to the youngest kids. We try to get some underspin on the volley. I teach them about slice. So that's a little more, it's a little more advanced than I think most coaches teach the volley. I definitely teach it in a slightly more complex, exquisite way, a detailed way. I don't like to do just simple, like punching, blocky, baby stuff with young kids. I like to challenge them and teach them about how to use their wrist to manipulate the ball. At the same time, I respect coaches who teach a simpler blocking volley. Tony Nadal is one of them. We talked about it in the last show, where he really believes in just that simple flat volley with extending through the ball, accompanying the ball, following the line of the ball. And, that's okay. Every coach is a little different. But for me, I'm partial to that Israeli approach, that beautiful, slightly complex volley style, learning how to apply different spins with the hand. I think there's a beauty to that, and it is an artistry to that I want my players to learn. That being said, what else? When I have a young kid in front of me, I work a lot on the feet. And it may be a Spanish thing, or I'm obsessed with the way the legs and the feet are working. In Spain, they work a lot on rising up to the net. They use that terminology a lot, which I like. Rising to the net. So you rise up after a good shot, like a big forehand. You rise up and you try to pause with the good split step. Una pausa. Tony Nadal talks about it a lot. You rise and then you pause. And then you move for the volley. And I think that rhythm of the feet, that sequence, that timing is easy to describe. And some of you may be listening being like, yeah, duh. You move forward, you split step, you volley. But in my experience, especially with young kids, that movement sequence needs to be honed and practiced a lot of repetition on that, on those footwork sequences, starting from the midcourt, crossing through the service line, and then finally moving to the net. Those sequences have to be practiced over and over again, because they have to be automatic, and the players often forget how they forget how to do it. They get sloppy with their footwork, and in my experience, that is one of the hardest things for kids to manage, is with their feet. When do they split step? We talk about the split step all the time. Everyone says split step. Coaches know split step, but the split step is usually done wrong. The timing is poor. The kids don't leave the ground right before the impact. They're either early or they're late. Or some kids don't split step at all. A lot of times kids will just run straight forward to the net. And what I found in my practice, on my teaching course, I like to spend a lot of time. We'll shadow and rehearse those movements without the ball, and then introduce the ball and make sure, and then finally introduce live points. And I make sure I watch the players really carefully to make sure that when they do choose to rise to the net, they're executing that sequence of steps very well, and they're timing the split step, they're pausing, they're not just running through shots. And then I try to link that to the footwork for the volley, which is relatively unique. One of the unique things is when you make the impact, typically on a standard volley, the foot is still in the air. So a lot of players struggle with that. They try to plant their foot like a ground stroke. On a ground stroke, you plant your feet and then you make your swing. But on the volley, it's more fluid and continuous. You make your swing as you're stepping. And the foot usually comes to the ground after the ball is struck. So there's the impact of the ball, and then your foot contacts the ground almost simultaneously or slightly after. So I think that timing of the step, learning how to make that lunging step, sometimes they call it a power lunge, loading the leg. After the split step, you load the back leg, get a power lunge, almost a jumping step forward, which gives you the closing in aspect. And then learning how to time the impact of the ball with the movement of the opposite foot. I think that is also really critical. So I dial in and drill down into the footwork and movement, starting with that Y movement. Player hits an approach, comes forward on the neck of the Y, and then the Y branches out left or right with where there's a split step. So you're coming up the trunk of the Y, and then you split step, and then you branch out left or right. And there's a lot of footwork to that. And the players have to learn to time it. And things happen so quickly at the net that oftentimes players, they freeze, they panic, they get stressed, because the volley itself is not that complex technique. Even the Israeli volley is just adding a little cut, a little spin with the wrist, a little bit of the wrist, and downward swing path of the racket. But the volley is a pretty short movement, and it's not as complex as the ground strokes or serve by any means, technically. But what makes the volley difficult is that you're robbed of time. You're closer to the net, so the ball's coming faster, you have less time to react, and so players get stressed out and they have trouble executing their technique under that time pressure. I think that's really the challenge. So, those are some ideas for you. Make sure you have a good grip. If you believe in slice volley, encourage young kids to go right, to work on applying different spins to the ball. Spend a lot of time on the footwork. If you have one footwork to master, it's that Y footwork, where you're rising, you're learning how to pause and stop your body and split, and then making a power lunge forward to the ball on a diagonal. I think that simple Y movement pattern is fundamental. And even if you're working 10 or 20% of the time with a kid, don't just park them at the net and work on keeping the wrists firm. Don't do those silly country club type volley lessons and give out those volley tips, firm wrist. Yeah, of course, firm wrist, don't just have your players stand statically. Always work on the flow, because that's what they're going to need in singles and doubles too. Doubles is a little more lateral sometimes. But, the players are going to need to learn how to flow from a ground stroke forward, time a split step, and then make another flow on a diagonal with the power lunge. And to me, that's where the rubber meets the road. That's the critical element of footwork to practice, though it involves the running, the splitting. Sometimes the split technique is not good, like the player's too narrow, or they're not on their toes, or their balance could be off when they split. And then work on the timing of the lunging technique, where they're making the impact at the appropriate time. Those are some of the most important footwork and technical aspects. I think it's a myth that there's no swing. I get that a lot from kids. There's no swing on the volley, right? You just block the ball. I mean, that's not true at all. It's never been true. I believe in being honest with children. You tell them, look, the volley is, there is a swing, and the kids oftentimes will look at me like, whoa, what do you mean? Yeah, there's a swing, and depending on the speed of the ball, you need to adjust your swing to the speed of the incoming ball. I mean, I think that's a much more intelligent way to describe it to a kid, rather than just saying, volley means you stick your racket out and you just go big hand and block. I don't like that. It's too babyish. So my recommendation is to explain to a kid that you have these parameters, and you have maybe 12 or 18 inches for a typical volley swing, which is a short swing. You try to extend through the line of the shot the Spanish way. Accompany the ball. Don't chop downward too much, like vertically down. Go downward on an angle, but keep extending out to the target. Definitely try to keep your wrist firm. A lot of kids really struggle to keep the wrist firm, but that should be in the context of movement, a dynamic movement, a dynamic lunging to the ball, dynamic footwork. Not just standing statically and working on keep the wrist firm. Unless you have a kid who's really struggling with their strength in their forearm, I do have some good drills for a kid getting the reps to keep the wrist more solid, but that's like a specialty case. In general, try to keep things dynamic, focus on the feet, and focus on the feet in coordination with the handwork. The backhand volley, typically the hands move away, the hands break apart. And on the forehand volley, I like to teach the hands coming together, kind of a little bit mirror image. That's an old Israeli technique. The hands come inward a little bit. There's some different options for the hand positions, but I like to teach that. I like to explain that to kids, help them think about hands coming together, hands coming apart, hands a little more together for forehand volley. It's not the only way to hit a forehand volley, but I'm just saying as an outline, a blueprint, a model for a child to learn. Then I think that's very helpful to understand the opposites. Forehand volley, I turn my shoulders, my hands come together a little bit. Backhand volley, I turn my shoulders and my hands go apart. So those kind of simple things, simple technique. If you need more volley technique resources, I recommend my book, my first book, The Tennis Technique Bible, where we have a whole chapter on the volley. I believe that's in volume 1 of the Tennis Technique Bible. I'll have to double check that. I believe we have a whole chapter on the volley, both volleys, forehand, backhand volley. And the resource tennisplayer.net, the magazine, the technical magazine, is excellent. And John Yandel and I have written many articles. We've co-authored articles. I write a lot of articles for them, and we have some really good resources there for the volley. You know, if you need technical help, you can also message me directly, send me some videos. You know, parents love to do that. I get lots of videos every week from parents and also from coaches who are learning from me, whether it's through my distance courses, my video courses, or they somehow connected with me either in person or online or at conferences or whatever. You know, if you have questions about the volley, just shoot me some videos, shoot me some questions, and I will do my best to answer, because obviously there's a lot of technical nuances, and I didn't want to make it a dreary podcast, you know. I just wanted to touch on some of the elements that I love to work on with my students, but there are many smaller details that I can't cover in one show. And if you have a specific question, please reach out to me and we can talk volley, we can talk the net. I wanted to close and just sort of mention that the era of serve and volley, I don't know what's going to happen. It's over, and I really hope it comes back in some form, because I miss the stylistic matchups. I miss that you would see a serve and volley or play a baseline player. I thought it added a lot of color and entertainment to the game. It's fun to see different styles. Similar to MMA, where it's fun to see a wrestler fight a boxer. It's fun to see a jiu-jitsu guy challenge a kickboxer or what have you. In tennis, is always one of the things I loved about tennis as a kid is you'd see these different stylistic matchups. And I think that's something sorely missed in today's game. So I have a hope that the serve and volley can return. I don't know if it's going to require the balls to get faster again, the courts to get a little faster. I'd love to see more variety in court surface speed. Right now, there's a homogeneity to the tour. You know, the clay and the hard courts are not that far apart in speed, and so what you have is players who are all playing the same way. So I hope that in the future there's a place for a serve and volley player. It may require a really big athletic kid, like someone very maybe tall. There's a lot more taller players now. Maybe someone who has got a really big serve, 6'6", and moves like LeBron. You know, it may require a better athlete to make it happen, or the tour may have to make some changes to the speed of the court, the speed of the balls. You know, the balls have a little bit less compression now, and then they're not traveling as fast, and you know, so some of it may be the environment of the game, and some of it may be the athletes may have to step up. A bigger, more explosive athlete may have to step up and make the serve and volley popular again. But I think it's not out of the realm of possibility, but certainly in the short term, we are not seeing many players who are moving to net behind the serve that much, but you are seeing more players trying to shorten points and who are quite successful at the net. So I'm encouraged by that. But remember, as a final thought, the baseline is the priority. Don't let a kid go through the junior years with holes in their baseline game. Don't sacrifice a baseline game to the net game. If a player wants to have a good net game, you can bargain with them and tell them, hey, no problem. Let's work on your net game. But you need to be solid from the backcourt too. You have to have both. Do not let a kid grow up with big holes in the baseline game. I repeat, do not let a kid grow up with big holes in the base. It creates a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress. It's fine to work on the volley, but not to the detriment of a solid baseline game. So look out for the magicians. If you have a magician in who you're working with or you're training, that kid is going to want to play a little more at the net and honor that, cherish that and nurture that. However, even that magician needs to learn how to be solid from the baseline. That will give them a lot more confidence and give them more tactical options also when they play. So, great show, guys. I look forward to seeing you in the next few weeks. We have more shows rolling out here in the new year, 2021. Happy New Year, everyone. This was the first show of 2021. I promised you the volley episode. I hope you enjoyed it. So we are going to do I had some interesting show topics coming up. I will share those with you very soon. Thank you for supporting the show. Thank you for your likes and your thumbs up and your recommendations. Thank you for sharing the show with others. And remember, you can find me at chrislewitt.com. You can find me at prodigymaker.com, which is my blog. If you're interested in following my writing or what I'm doing with my coaching or what's happening with the Academy in Manchester, Vermont. You can follow me in many ways on socials. I appreciate the support. I appreciate you taking the time to listen to my thoughts on junior development. And I hope to see you guys more in the new year. So have a great day, and I will talk to you guys on the next program.